Hi, welcome to IELTS with Nick. Now, something that people struggle with often in the IELTS test is speaking part 3 and developing their ideas for speaking part 3. People sometimes think that they need to know more about the topic, that they need to be an expert in the environment and in education and in technology. You don't need to be an expert, and you probably know enough already about all of these topics. But it's about picking the right points and then developing simple points. Okay, so not picking out complex questions, but developing simple ones. So let's look at an example, okay? I'm going to give you an example answer talking about social media. And the question is, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of using social media? That's our question. Listen to my first answer. Well, some of the advantages of using social media are that we can contact friends and family around the world, and we can watch stuff that we're interested in. Some of the disadvantages are that it's addictive and it's bad for our mental health. So, what did you think? Those were 4 good points, 2 positive, 2 negative, but they're quite underdeveloped. So for each of these points, we need to say a little more and give some examples. So, listen to this second answer. Now, the question stays the same: advantages and disadvantages of social media. So, I think if you'd asked me that question 10 years ago, I would have answered it quite differently, and I would have been much more positive about social media. It allows us to keep in touch with friends and family around the world. It also allows us to watch content that we're interested in, so we can tailor the content that we're seeing to a particular sport or hobby that we're interested in, like basketball or cooking, for example. But in recent years, we've seen a lot of negatives of social media. We can see that it's highly addictive, that people get hooked on scrolling through content. We see people glued to their screens out and about. We see a real disconnect between people in society. And it's also bad for mental health as well, because social media is generally full of these ideal pictures and perfect lives. People, particularly young people, find it difficult to live up to these standards. Okay, so I used the same 4 points there. I talked about getting in contact with friends and family. I talked about tailoring content to what we're interested in. And on the negative side, I talked about addiction and mental health. Okay, so the same points, but I developed much more in that second answer. Notice that I didn't talk about everything to do with social media. You know, I could have talked about that it's useful for business and networking and marketing, but I didn't talk about that. I also could have talked about the fact that there's a lot of false information and fake news that comes through social media. I didn't talk about that. You don't need to talk about everything, otherwise you'd be talking about social media for 20 minutes, and that's too long, right? So just pick out a couple of points, and if it's an advantage, disadvantage answer like this one, then probably 2 advantages, 2 disadvantages is enough, and then we need to develop them. So how did I develop these? Well, I talked about friends and family, and then I talked about friends and family around the world. And I used an example of Instagram as a platform. We can share photos and videos, and that helps us to see what's happening in our loved ones' lives. So giving that extra example is important. On the other side, I talked about mental health, and I talked about comparing yourself to the things you see online. And I talked specifically about younger people as well. Again, I'm giving an example here, and I'm talking about the same point, but I'm just giving a bit more information. Also, maybe you noticed how I broke the question in half a little bit. I talked about the past and I talked about the present. So I started by saying, if you'd asked me that question 10 years ago, if you'd asked me that question 10 years ago. Now, that's a third conditional structure. And if we're going to break the question into the past and the present, then it makes sense in this context to use the third conditional. Now, this only works for some questions, right? You certainly can't use this for every question in part 3, but it does work for some questions, and it works for this one. It works for social media because personally, my opinion of social media has changed from 10 years ago to what I think about it now. You also might have noticed that I used some phrasal verbs as well, like get in touch with, keep up to date with, scroll through. I also talked about being glued to the screen. That's an idiom that fits in quite nicely here because that's the topic, that's the context. So if you're able to add in a bit of this language, that's good for your score as well in the vocabulary section of the criteria. Now, obviously, I've had time to think about this question. I didn't write a script, but I had time to think about it and consider what my answers were going to be. And this is what you should be doing in your preparation for the test. And I can help you with this. If you're having trouble with part 3, you can book a private lesson with me and I can help you identify where your strengths and your weaknesses are in part 3. And I can help you to build ideas and opinions for this section of the test. Okay, good luck with the test. See you next time.